Welcome, everyone. I would like to present the fall of the Aztec Empire. All the information in this presentation comes from David Carrasco's book, The Aztecs, a very short introduction. This topic is found in chapter 7, and so let's begin. So, this map is showing um, basically the progress from Cuba to Tenochtitlan, where Hernan Cortes arrived and began his conquest from the supervision of Governor Velasquez, who was commissioned by the Spanish monarchy to set up a headquarters here in Santiago de Cuba. And Cortes was one of the men who was sent on expedition to explore the land and see what he could find. Well, he lands at Cozumel in 1519 with some men, and he there launched his expedition. Now, this fall of the Aztec Empire was pretty much a short time. It only took less than 2 years, less than 24 months for the Aztec Empire to fall and lose their political and economic dominion over the entire land. Of course, they weren't the only people in the Mexican peninsula. We can see there was other tribes, and Cortez would first meet the Mayans. And so this expedition shows the progress that he made around the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and eventually would set up his own authority in what he would call Villa Rica de Veracruz, which translates to the rich town of the True Cross. So we can see the Catholic influence, and of course, with the rich town, he was on a quest for gold. And we'll dive more into that in the coming slides on the motives. But this is where it all began on the earliest stages of the fall of the Aztec Empire. So, the most important factor of really any culture is language, because this is where history and tradition and just lifestyle is communicated and passed on. So, this was a huge factor that would serve as a catalyst for the fall of the Aztec Empire. Now, of course, Spanish is spoken from Spain, um, and uh, Nahuatl, or the Mayan dialect, was spoken in the Mexican peninsula in the 16th century. So there had to be someone who could bridge as a mediator between Cortes and the Spanish, and of course the Aztecs, the Mexica, and the other indigenous people. Well, that person was just providentially provided when Cortes met priest Geronimo de Aguilar. He was a Spanish priest who actually was shipwrecked, um, supposedly earlier in 1511, right there near Cozumel. And so Cortes runs into him. He learns all about Aguilar's life, and Aguilar had shared with him over the last 8 years at this point what the Mayan way of life was like, and he picked up the language. So he still knew Spanish, and of course he learned Mayan. So he was a mediator um, with the native tongue of the Mayans and with his own mother tongue of Spanish, able to translate. So he served as an informant to Cortes. He wasn't in allegiance with the Mayan people or, of course, the Aztecs. We come to find out the Mayans and the Aztecs were against each other. As the Aztecs had the greatest political dominion, the other tribes, excuse me, in the neighboring areas were not submitted to that. And so Aguilar saw this as an opportunity for protection, and he was used mightily to weaponize communication. And he was another key factor in the Spanish and Cortez's recruiting soldiers, indigenous soldiers, to form his army. Of course, after 8 years, Aguilar learned about the weaknesses of the indigenous cultures of Mesoamerica. And so he was able to expose a lot of strengths and weaknesses so that the Spanish could better prepare for their plan of conquest. Of course, he was the beginning translator, but more notorious and uh, critical in the history of the fall of the Aztec Empire was a native woman named Malintzin, aka Malinche, or the Spanish called her Doña Marina. Well, she was known as the most critical alliance, and was able to take the Spanish beyond the Mayans and all the way to the Aztec rulers such as Montezuma and the other Aztec nobles. So she set up meetings and was able to translate accordingly. So here we focus more in on this woman, Malintzin. She spoke Aztec, Nahuatl, Mayan, and she quickly learned Spanish. So she was very intelligent, and she used this as an advantage for protection. Um, and if it wasn't for her, some historians have said that there never would have been Spanish conquest to the degree that there was because of the access, as we see here in this illustration from the Florentine Codex, excuse me, translating between the Aztec nobles and the Spanish. So after the Spanish tried to recruit the Mayans and defeated them in battle, she was given as a spoil of war, along with other women, to the Spanish. And Cortez actually impregnates her and gives birth to what some say is his favorite son, Martin. So, of course, as the mother of your child, she has a now new level of allegiance to the Spanish conquest. Some see her today as a traitor. Others see her as the bridge between two cultures in what we know modern Mexico to be. So mixed opinions about her, but nevertheless, she serves as a key link between the Spanish and Aztec culture. And one can only wonder, would the conquest have happened within the short 2 years, less than 24 months, without her translation? Well, next up, we cover the hazardous road to the great city of Mexico. So, as Cortez was making conquests all the way from Cozumel to the great city, Tenochtitlan, he was encountering different tribes, and his quest was unmistakably for gold. There's other motives that have been disclosed, such as evangelism and the conversion of the world to Catholicism under the Spanish's interpretation of the Bible. But nevertheless, gold was a main one. And this is true because the wealthiest place in the Mexican Peninsula, in the basin of Mexico at this time, was the Aztec Empire. And so, as these other tribes who are against the Aztec rule are encountering the Spanish, they're learning about how much wealth the great city possesses. So, of course, if the Spanish motive is to acquire this wealth, then they are going to play off of um, the rivals between native tribes and the Aztecs. And so they do that. And so it's really only 500 Spanish soldiers who strategically recruit native alliances along the way. As they encounter them, they discover this news of gold. And so they make their way uh, west, northwest to the city of Tenochtitlan. Well, Cortez is motivated by these reports. He marches with his army as he acquires more soldiers who are trained warriors. And so, two of the most key factors that Carrasco refers to in chapter 7 are the Totonacs of Zempoala and the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans would be the most famous and recognized to take down Tenochtitlan and overthrow the Aztec Empire. Interesting fact, the Totonacs, they supplied the Spanish with information and intel regarding the war strategies of the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan right here. Notice the causeways. So there was, apart from this great water distance, there was land bridges that would connect the surrounding areas to the great city. And of course, these causeways were used for travel, for import and export of goods and trade, and they would go on to become ways to access and destroy the city apart from the waterways. So the natives knew this, and they certainly shared that with Cortez, who combined efforts to find strategies to penetrate the protection of the city and eventually overthrow it. Now, interestingly, too, about the Tlaxcalans is the simple fact that um, they were resistant of the Spanish as they first came in. So they resisted until they lost a battle, and then these four provinces of Tlaxcala supplied strong warriors that would join forces with Cortez. Here we see some of the weapons along the way. Now, these weapons were atrocious. These were terrible, terrible weapons that were used to subjugate and destroy and harm the Mexica people, from flesh-eating dogs that were dogs of war trained to kill and attack. Crossbows were very sophisticated, very deadly, very dangerous, and could be used from far distances. The harquebus was basically early musket or rifle, another strong um, weapon that could be used from far distances. And of course, the Aztecs knew nothing of gunpowder and these things, so the Spanish would bring that technology and also apply that to mobile cannons that would cause a lot of devastation and destruction of the temple, of um, any Aztec defenses, breaking down the Great Wall, as we see here. These brigantines, the Spanish warships, they had cannons that would shoot down the exterior walls of Tenochtitlan. Of course, we see armor, which the Aztecs did not have. This steel armor from Europe that after the Crusades had been modified, and definitely after several years of battle on the Iberian Peninsula, they dialed it in to resist what the Aztecs were fighting with, spears and flint rock and these types of things. Of course, hand-to-hand combat occurred with the rapier. I think that's how you pronounce it, the long sword. And so we can see there was a lot of modern technology in the weapons of Spanish conquest that were used to destroy. Here we see the Tlaxcalans fighting alongside the Spanish, as they also have their war horses, which is something the Aztecs had never seen prior to Spanish conquest and arrival. And they brought great resistance. They were trained warriors as well and no strangers to battle. But the brutality, dismemberment, and just the bodies slain all over the Mexican peninsula in this period of history were extensive. Well, the turning point, of course, as Cortez is making his way into Tenochtitlan, was Cortez captured Montezuma. He was received with welcome initially, and Cortez, graciously gave gifts to the Spanish, and he showed all the beauty and the wonderment of the Aztec Empire. Well, as reports and suspicions arose of potential rebellion, the Spanish were paranoid and they took Montezuma captive. Of course, they were motivated again by their conquest for gold and power and dominion. And so they manipulated Montezuma, and they basically used him as a puppet ruler. Well, meanwhile, Cortez's lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, actually at one of the feasts to the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca, he took it upon himself to murder thousands of men and women and Aztecs during this feast. And so that really was a key turning point that now engaged the Aztecs in what would go on to be a great battle. Um, and so, of course, the Mexica wanted revenge. The Aztecs fought back on June 24th, 1520. The whole city, Tenochtitlan, erupted in war. And we see these weapons of warfare, the cannons, the spears, the cavalry, you know, and the allegiances between the Spanish and the Tlaxcalans in full effect. So around here, we see the Aztecs in their animal dress, jaguar, and different animals that they esteemed as very sacred, and the brutality of the war that followed. Well, this war lasted over 3 weeks, and it was brutal. And Cortez was trying to coerce Montezuma to call the Aztecs to back down, but they would not have it. They would not back down. And so this went on to erupt in serious massacre, serious bloodshed, and the eventual murder of Montezuma. Well, the Spanish had always seen the natives as inferior for their agenda. They claimed that it was their God-given right to conquer these Mesoamerican lands, and they refused to leave, as the Spanish were um, fighting the Aztecs, were trying to drive them out of the city. Well, Spanish Governor Velasquez of Cuba, as we mentioned earlier, he commissioned 1,400 Spanish soldiers to arrest Cortez for abusing the original contract and deal of the expedition. And so he sends these men out which were, almost 3 times the size of his initial army of Spanish soldiers. And of course, Cortez had the indigenous alliances. But somehow Cortez caught wind of this. Well, he prepares for Velasquez's troops to come, and he actually counterattacks them, knowing the land now at this point, and having connections with the natives. Um, he was ready, and so he not only physically attacks, but mentally he manages to bribe Velasquez's men with the lust of the flesh, with the conquests and spoils of war, such as women and wealth, the gold, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. He has these tales of heroic adventures and the fame and the glory, and so he recruited uh, Velasquez's army, and they joined in his conquest to take down the Aztec Empire with promise of power and wealth and women. And so Cortez's multi-ethnic army is now 3 times the original size of those initial 500 men. So this was a huge turning point after already many, many engagements in battle. And you can see the relentlessness and just again, in a strange turn of events and the manipulative power of Cortez, this really changed. So after 3 weeks of Aztec resistance, Montezuma was murdered. Some say it was by the Spanish, and some say it was by the Aztecs who saw him as a traitor. So Montezuma's brother, Cuitlahua, he spurs the remaining Aztecs to keep fighting and to push these men, these enemies of our great city, out. Well, this is what resulted in the famous Noche Triste of 1520, which is translated to the Night of Sadness or Sorrows. Here we see the Spaniards fighting the Aztecs from the source, the Alianza de Tlaxcala, which is a Tlaxcalan history record, pictographs, and collection of events of these the fall of the Aztec Empire. And so more than 800 Spaniards and 2,000 Tlaxcalans were killed. Uh, it was so bad that historians report in Carrasco's source you could walk on water because the canals were filled with dismembered corpses from the battle. It was just brutal, brutal battle. So approximately 400 Spanish warriors survived, and in wounded, humiliated, they retreat back to the territory of Tlaxcala. And for the next 5.5 months, they plan and plot to regroup and strategize to conquer in the siege and takeover of Tenochtitlan. So again, relentless, and they will not go home defeated. They will regroup and find a way to conquer. Well, meanwhile, we have another strange turn of events in the smallpox epidemic. Now, I would believe after reading chapter 7 of the Fall of the Aztec Empire in Carrasco's book that it wouldn't have happened. I mean, we see how strong the Aztec resistance was, even in the face of the Spanish war technology, and even in the face of the language translation, and even in the face of the Civil War and the indigenous alliances that the Spanish utilized against the Aztecs. But the smallpox, this European disease, served to do more damage in a faster amount of time than really anything. And it really weakened on a great level from the top of the social structure of the Aztec Empire to just the common civilians. So 40% of the population died in less than a year. So this was crazy. And there was no vaccine, there was no way to treat it. And furthermore, it destroyed living conditions in Mesoamerica and in Tenochtitlan. There was great famines, dying of starvation. Of course, people so weak and sick that they could no longer do their jobs. The water supply was polluted, and so this was a great, nothing new under the sun, but employed military tactic to weaken, Aztec resistance and take down the empire through this invisible enemy through microbiology. And Cortez saw this as an opportunity. So he salvages, as he's strategizing in the territory of Tlaxcala, ship materials to build the 1342-foot long brigantines. And these brigantines were carried by other natives from the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of Cozumel. And they carried all these supplies and reassembled them um, and then launched them off on Lake Texcoco. So this was full-scale invasion going down. And so also in the process, Cortez is employing the Tlaxcalan and other native warriors to spy out on the lake and to see, the weaknesses of the Aztecs, and meanwhile fighting and recruiting other alliances. So they were going in, and they were going in full force. Well, of course, May 1521 was the invasion, and now Cortez used the causeways, as I mentioned earlier, to cut off access to the city and travel in and out. He cut off food and water supply. And so there was a great impact that had to weaken the resistance. Cannons were used to intimidate, destroy, and demolish the Great Temple. And this was a map of engraving before the destruction, as we can see here in one of Cortez's letters printed in 1524. And so these brigantines from Dr. Estrada's lecture were image of what it looked like as these cannonballs would fly and destroy the perimeter of the city. And so also they transport soldiers and weapons and supplies um, to aid them in the Great Siege. Well, the siege lasted 3 months, and in the process, um, it was just devastating. 90% of the army that Cortez was leading was comprised of Tlaxcalans and warriors from other native city states. Now, number wise, the Spanish went into this battle with 700 foot soldiers, 120 crossbowmen and riflemen, and 90 horsemen. So, not a huge army to take on the thousands of um, Mexica people. Now, uh, Carrasco mentioned that the attitude of the Spanish was very proud. Prior to this great fall of the empire, they were singing, "Who could conquer Tenochtitlan? Who could shake the foundations of the heaven?" And when the Spanish came, they were probably shocked to see the devastation and what had come as a result of their rising to power. So cannons and catapults were used. Three directions. There was all those causeways, and of course, being surrounded by water gave a lot of open access, so it made it very hard to fight off the Spanish. Cortez also was reported in Carrasco's book to divide his army into three sub-armies, and these were attacking from different directions. Um, well, this all went on, and again, we saw how driven the Spanish were and even the other indigenous to take down the Aztec rule, that they fought all the way until the last Tlatoani, which is the word, not word for spiritual leader or priest. His name was Cuauhtemoc, or Divine Eagle. Well, he was captured and finally surrendered to Cortez August 13th. So from May to August in 1521, this battle raged on, and the Spanish drove them out of Tenochtitlan all the way to the surrounding areas. Well, the last Aztec leader, Cuauhtemoc, was tortured and hung by Cortez, and thus ended the bloodline of the Aztec royal family forever. There was no one to take the throne after that, and the Spanish were there to dominate and conquer, and it is what they did. This painting is one of the greatest depictions I could find from all the resources. Really, just kind of in our mind, going back 500 years and seeing just how intense and epic this battle was from all angles: the causeways, the brigantines, the soldiers, the indigenous, the towns, everything, the temple here, and just a fight to the death, and the last men standing, bloodied and weakened from brutal resistance and war, were the Spanish and their allies. And so this artist is actually unknown who painted this from the 17th century, but this depicts the Battle of Tenochtitlan. So conquest aftermath, in summation. Well, the warriors, after they defeated, they went on to just pillage the sacred precinct and the surrounding villages, looking for gold, looking for anything of value and wealth amidst the bloody corpses. Well, the Aztec survivors were treated terribly and greatly oppressed. They were beaten, they were branded, and they were forced into slavery. Women were greatly raped by Spanish soldiers and native allies, and just horrible, horrible atrocities. War is chaos. And lasting result, the spread of the Catholic Empire. Roman Catholicism greatly infiltrated Mexico and still remains today. Of course, they remodeled the temples and turned them into all kinds of Catholic shrines and erected all kinds of Catholic temples and places of worship. And there is a great syncretism that we've learned about throughout this book, how the Mexica, the Aztecs, blended Catholicism with their um, you know, gods and rituals. And of course, the most lasting result today is the mestizo people, which is the Spanish and native mixed posterity. So to sum it all up, how did the Aztec Empire fall? Just to recap, they overthrew the Aztec Empire by advanced war technology such as cannons, falconets, which are another smaller catapult cannon, harquebuses or rifles, crossbows, their war dogs, horses, their ships, their brigantines, and their armor. Second part that they used to make the Aztec Empire fall was their civil war opportunity with the rival Mesoamericans who were recruited in the thousands by Cortez to fight alongside Spanish against the Aztecs, such as the Tlaxcalans and other indigenous, the Totonacs. Then, of course, one of the greatest impacts was the European disease smallpox, as we saw, claimed over 40%, thousands of lives of Mesoamericans in central Mexico. Definitely spread fear. They'd never known anything like this and weakened the Aztec resistance from nobles and all the way down to civilians. And then, of course, last, as we mentioned, the communication, the weaponizing of communication, and La Malinche, Doña Marina, she served as that critical liaison between the Spanish and the Aztecs. So thank you so much for listening and for hearing how the Aztec Empire fell. Here are my sources for the images. And until next time, take care.